All right. Well, thank you all for joining our second talk of our four-part summer series, Collective Liberation. I am Tiffany Goodwin Van Camp, the Executive Director of American Friends of Combatants for Peace. Founded in 2006 by former combatants who chose to lay down their arms and join hands to stop the violence and the injustice, Combatants for Peace is a joint Palestinian-Israeli community working in solidarity to end the occupation, discrimination, and oppression. Guided by the values of nonviolent resistance, they are showing themselves and the world that there is another way. We, their American friends, are a diverse community of US and international activists working in solidarity with CFP. We raise awareness, build resources and community, and take direct action to advance a just peace in Israel and Palestine. Collectively, we believe in a future where all people from the river to the sea live in peace with dignity, justice, and liberty. So this four-part summer series that we created, we did this to help our community explore the intersectionality of systemic oppression in Palestine and Israel and throughout the globe, and to explore the intersectionality of how we get free together. It is rooted in the tradition of the civil rights movement, which asserts that, by its leaders, it asserts that nobody is free until everybody is free, and that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that when we help each other get free, we free ourselves. So today's topic is Diaspora Jews United to End the Occupation. And we are honored to have our speakers, Hadar Cohen and Eva Borgwardt, as well as our moderator, Rabbi Sheila Weinberg. A little bit about our leaders today. So Hadar is an Arab Jewish scholar, mystic, artist, and political writer. She is a 10th generation Jerusalemite with lineage roots also in Syria, Kurdistan, Iraq, and Iran. And she is the founder of Malchut, a spiritual skill building school teaching Jewish mysticism. Eva is the political director of If Not Now, a movement of American Jews organizing for equality, justice, and a thriving future for all. She's been organizing on Israel and Palestine since 2014, focusing on the American Jewish community. And Rabbi Sheila has served as a congregational rabbi for 17 years. She is widely published on topics such as feminism, spiritual direction, mindfulness, and social justice. She's also the author of a new book called Let Us Breathe Together, a collection of poems and essays that explore ways to unite faith with reality. And if that's not enough, Sheila is also a leader of our AFCFP's Thriving Philly chapter. So we have a few chapters as an organization, and Sheila leads our largest chapter in Philadelphia, which includes, unique to all our chapters, that she helps lead multi-narrative tours to Israel and Palestine. Quick housekeeping before we start. So we will be taking questions throughout this talk that we will share with the speakers closer to the end. And you can send your questions to the profiles that you see on the screen that say send questions here. Caitlin, if you don't mind changing your name, it says your name. So if you see a Caitlin, it'll soon say send questions here. You can send questions to Caitlin, and then you can send questions to Lindsay. And with that, I would like to hand this over to Rabbi Sheila Weinberg. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. It really is. And I'll just say a couple of words about our chapter because we're very proud of it and excited, and maybe it'll inspire others. So my husband, Maynard Cedar, and I were on the first trip in 2018 of the Combatants for Peace that they took us, the dual narrative trip. And we were very moved. And when we came back to our neighborhood in Philadelphia, we started teaching and talking about it and gathered a group. We brought two of the combatants. It was right before COVID. And we brought two of them here for a program. And we continued to meet until October, this past 2022, when we organized a trip from Philadelphia, essentially, which was also a dual narrative trip. And we had one or two people that weren't from Philadelphia. It was a mixed faith group. We had groups of Quakers, Philadelphia folks, and Jews, primarily people who had various connections to both politics and also to their own history and family. It was a very profound and moving trip for everyone. And since we're back, we are meeting regularly, we are connecting, and we are looking really for ways that we can make a difference in this time. We were there right before the election. We are very much opposed to the occupation and the injustice. And we are very much supportive of justice and peace within both our own nation, which needs it at this moment, the USA, and also we feel so connected to Israel and Palestine. So that's that story. If anybody's interested in the chapter, you can be in touch with me. So I'm happy that Hadar and Eva are both here. Very excited to meet them and hear from them. And I'd just like you to start really to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about yourselves and what brought you to this work of justice, of liberation, of peace. So maybe Hadar, you want to begin, and we go back and forth.
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, I just wanted to say, such an honor to be here with so many beautiful people joining us. Yeah, it feels really inspiring to share this space together around justice and movement building. And yeah, I'll share a little bit. My name is Hadar. I was born in Jerusalem. My family comes from all over the Middle East region. We've been in Jerusalem 10 generations, also have Kurdish roots, Baghdadi roots, Aleppo roots. And I grew up being really ashamed around my identity and who I am. Because, especially growing up under Israeli society, there's this understanding that, to be Arab is kind of to be the enemy or something that is frowned upon. The Arabic language, I grew up, my grandparents would speak Arabic, listen to Arabic music, but I remember even as a child, it wasn't something that it was something that I was to hide a lot because I felt really embarrassed. And then when I was 10, we moved to the US, and that was a whole other process of learning about American Jewish world. And as I became more of an adult, I started asking questions around who I am and what is my identity and where do I come from and where did all this shame come from around really being who I am. And that really happened through my connection to my grandma, is listening to her stories. And she was born in Jerusalem in the 30s and, grew up with Palestinian Muslims and Christians in the old city. And these stories really stayed in my heart. And she passed away a couple of years ago, and it was a very big loss for me. And one of the things that I felt, not just losing her, I also felt that I lost the world that she knew, this world of Jerusalem that, to me, through her memories, felt so cosmopolitan, so multi-religious, so devotional. And I come from a very spiritual family as well. And, I think that through unpacking my own personal roots and reclaiming myself as an Arab Jew, learning more to be proud of actually where I come from, of this Middle Eastern identity, the more that I did that, the more that I realized all these forces of systemic oppression that were, trying to really erase my identity, whether it's the Westernization, the colonization, Zionism, all these really big forces, and seeing really who they're targeting and the ways in which, particularly Arab Jewish communities were ripped out of the context of the larger Arab world and also of the mutuality of our faiths with Palestinians. And that shift really inspired me to first actually just start building relationships with Palestinians and start hearing their stories through their own voice and more authentically, and learn to really let go of some of the Israeli propaganda that I think a lot of Jewish people are fed, kind of spoon-fed to believe all these stories that really, really kind of tell the Palestinian story in a very twisted and disoriented way. And the more that I started listening to Palestinians directly and building relationships and feeling the love, feeling actually the mutuality, for me, something solidarity, it's not something that you do for other people because you feel bad for them or you feel pity and you're like, wow, look at these people, they're oppressed. Like, actually, there's a mutuality. Like, I really, in my heart, believe that, specifically about this relationship between Arab Jews and Palestinians. Like, I feel like our fates are really shared. And the more that I want to uncover who I am and where I come from and be proud of that, the more that I also have to show up for Palestinian liberation and fight against the very scary and very heartbreaking oppression that the Israeli state is perpetuating against Palestinian people. And I think that, learning, my work has been a lot about learning to decondition the way that I was trained to see Palestinians as the enemy, and actually really understand that they're actually my family. These are people that my grandma grew up with. These are the people that, my shared lineage comes from. These are my family. These are my people that my fate is bound up with. So yeah, I don't know if to stop there. I could keep going forever, but I'll just stop there.
Great. That's wonderful, Hadar. Thank you. Thank you. I love that mutuality, that power of mutuality. Eva, tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this work.
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Hadar, and thanks so much also to American Friends of Advance for Peace and everyone for hosting this, and just echoing like such an honor and so powerful to be in this virtual space gathered with all of you. And yeah, in terms of how I came to this work, a lot of my origin story is from like social justice movements in the US. My dad is a Jew by choice, whose ancestry is German, hence the very German last name. And my mom is Ashkenazi and comes from like Boston, East Coast Jewish family. I graduated high school and into the Ferguson uprising in 2014. My family was living in St. Louis, and my mom said to me, like, this is one of those moments where if you want to know where you were in the civil rights movement, you're doing it right now. And so I, headed out to Ferguson, and it was like 100 degrees in August in Missouri. And when I was there, like, I found my people who were this local social justice synagogue, and was able to sort of march in those protests in Ferguson with like-minded Jews who saw like Black liberation and Jewish liberation as intertwined. And then there were Palestinian rights, like signs, banners, chants, solidarity coming out of those protests. And I watched my Jewish community around me get super, super uncomfortable and kind of freak out and feel like frustrated about drawing the parallel. These two things are not the same. And I was 18, I could see the parallels, how Black Americans are facing a militarized police force and Palestinians are facing a military charged with policing. And folks are trading tips on Twitter about how to deal with tear gas and like facing this, again, like militarized force that like sees them as inherently a threat. It just felt so clear that my like lane and what it meant for me to like get your people in that moment was to like organize my community around Palestinian rights at the time for the sake of like helping us show up for domestic civil rights struggles, and feeling frustrated that our blind spot, our pain around Palestinian rights was getting in the way of us actually showing up in the US for the civil rights movement of our time. So I delved really deep into organizing on Israel-Palestine in the Jewish community all through college. And on graduating in 2020, I was into another like massive racial justice uprising. I definitely had a moment where I was like, why am I personally focusing so hard on something that's so many miles away when there's so much to do here that maybe we could make more progress on, and is not, sustaining so much vitriol and all the things that we know Israel-Palestine comes with in our politics. And then it just became very clear very quickly, and I was, agitated by dear friends who helped me see this, that like this Israel-Palestine, this issue, our blind spot around Palestinian liberation, all the things like gets in the way of and is weaponized to get in the way of domestic progressive social justice movements, politicians, candidates, leadership, and is used as a cudgel increasingly by Republicans, white supremacists, like people who really don't have Jewish best interests at heart, but to undermine all of our movements for justice here. And that actually there's a really powerful contribution to make by working on that, like in the interest of winning things that like I care about as an American Jew who is deeply rooted here and wants to win Green New Deal, Medicare for all, like all of those things, and seeing the ways in which seeing Palestinian liberation and Jewish liberation as mutually exclusive gets in the way of all of that.
Wow, wonderful, thank you. Again, the intersectionality that we were talking about, you really highlight. Before I go into the second question we have here that we wanted to offer, I just want to get a quick, someone came with a question for Hadar, just in a sentence or two. Can you explain what the term Arab Jew means?
Yeah, definitely. This is a very controversial identity. So, part of the Zionist narrative was very much, even nowadays in contemporary media, a lot of the conversation is like Jews versus Arabs, right? The Jews are fighting the Arabs. But really, there is this term called Arab Jews, which are Jews who are Arab, Jews who lived in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria or Egypt or Iraq or Yemen. The reason why I say it's a controversial term is because, there's different identity words for that. Sometimes the word Mizrahi is used. It's a political, sociological word that means Easterner. It got coined with the creation of the state of Israel. So it's very much kind of dependent on the politics of Israel. But, there's been a movement of Middle Eastern Jews who are claiming this identity, Arab Jew, as, a way of what I was sharing before, to see that our fate is actually bound with Arab people, right? We're not actually separate because we're Jewish from the Middle East, right? We actually belong to the Arab political dynamics and, the forces that try to pit us against, especially Arab Muslims, right? These are colonial Western European forces that have an interest in Jews and Muslims fighting each other. So to claim myself as an Arab Jew, it's a political choice to see myself as belonging to the Arab community and to the Arab people and to the Arab lands of which I come from. And actually, it's very exciting. I can share it here because this is something that's going to be published soon. I work with this Palestinian organization called Sabil, that's a liberation theology Christian center in Jerusalem, to curate a publication about Arab Jews. So that will be available online soon if you want to hear. It's a bunch of essays by Arab Jews about Arab Jewish identity and what that means.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. This is for both of you, and you've already moved in this direction, but we know that there is a current government in Israel that was elected this past fall, November, that is aligned with what we might call a Jewish supremacy movement. And I guess the names are interesting, just how we use the names. So a theocratic vision, really. And how do you see that as impacting Jews here, there, Palestinians, Arabs, in general? What's your understanding of this moment, this particular moment with this particular government? So maybe Eva, you want to start?
Sure. There's definitely a lot to be said about the effects of this government on the ground, and how effectively what's happening is, these trends have been proceeding in terms of more and more right-wing, more and more authoritarian, more and more exclusive about who's considered to be, a citizen of the state deserving of rights, and the tools that have been sharpened in enacting apartheid on Palestinians and occupation and repression on Palestinians are now being turned on Jewish Israeli citizens, and they do not like it. And that's part of what we're seeing. People have been drawing analogies to Trump in 2016, where white Americans for the first time were starting to feel sort of like the authoritarian and repressive potential of the US that particularly Black Americans and Americans of color have been feeling for a long time. I will let Hadar speak on that a little more in terms of on the ground stuff. I want to say something about what's happening in the US, because as Israel gets more and more authoritarian and more misaligned with the values of many Americans, particularly Americans who identify as Democrats or people who care about equality and justice and things like that. The more that happens, the more anti-democratic and repressive tactics need to be employed in our politics, in US politics, in order to maintain unconditional US support for that increasingly right-wing regime. And again, we've seen this deployed on Palestinian Americans for years, and it's getting worse and worse. And at the same time, we're seeing a right-wing organizations in the Jewish and pro-Israel establishment, AIPAC being the most extreme example of this, ally with white supremacist, insurrectionist, anti-democratic right-wing Republicans in order to preserve unconditional support for Israel, because those are the people who are interested in maintaining that unconditional relationship with a regime this authoritarian, this repressive, this willing to deny rights to certain groups of people based on their religion, nationality, ethnicity, the color of their skin. And that's dangerous for American Jews. Empowering those people is dangerous for us. It's a really, really crucial moment where we, as broadly as the American Jewish community, obviously encompasses several communities, but many of the establishment organizations that speak for us do not have a muscle around holding the Israeli government accountable. And they barely have a muscle around criticism of Israel, much less resistance, much less embracing Palestinians as human beings who are, B'Tselem Elohim, all created in the image of God, and willing to fight for their liberation and resist this regime. And so we actually it's contributing to a dangerous situation for American Jews and for Palestinian Americans and all Americans, because as we've seen organizations like AIPAC endorse 109 insurrectionist Republicans and undermine progressive leaders, usually of color, who are fighting for a Green New Deal, Medicare for all of these things that we want to win to be able to thrive in the US. And people who are opposed to democracy everywhere and opposed to rights for all people are allying with folks who also want that in the current Israeli government to try and maintain unconditional support. And the question is, can the American Jewish community start to develop that muscle and use this moment as a wake-up call to say, actually, no, denying rights for anyone is denying rights for all of us. We're seeing that loud and clear. And be able to sort of summon the courage in this moment, because the stakes are incredibly high.
Wow, great question. Great question. Really closing with a crucial question. Hadar, some comments on this current government and where you see it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ava. That was really beautiful. So just to add a few things to what Eva already spoke about, I think that in the US, right, in the last however many years, the last decade, there's been a lot of really incredible Black American organizers who have been really challenging the US system around issues of racial justice with the Black Lives Matter movement, with all sorts of protests. And one of the really big questions that they're bringing up to the table, which has been really impactful for everyone, is to really re-examine the founding of the United States, right? That it wasn't this happy American dream fairy tale, but actually was built on slavery, right? It was built on the slave trade. And it's a very uncomfortable thing to see. It's a very uncomfortable thing to understand how actually, because there hasn't been that reckoning, this system of anti-Blackness still continues to this day with mass incarceration, with all sorts of police violence. So there's something that needs to not just be addressed in the here now, but also something that needs to be examined about, well, what is the nature of this nation state and how was it founded? And what does that mean to actually undergo a justice process? And I actually feel that a very similar thing needs to happen with the state of Israel, right? Because a lot of the times there's, whether it's protests or movements that are, trying to show up for Palestinian liberation, but sometimes I feel that there's a bit of a denial of really examining the founding of the state of Israel and really reckoning with the Nakba and what that meant to, have so many Palestinian villages just be completely wiped off the map, right? And it's still ongoing, right? It's not something that just happened in 48. It's been happening every year since then. So, this kind of ongoing ethnic cleansing has not been really addressed. And, there is something, as Ava spoke about as well, that especially in the American context, and not just American Jewish, just American in general, where it seems that Israel is a bit untouchable, right? We cannot hold Israel accountable because there's a certain fantasy of what Israel is, right? People are not really dealing with what's happening in the reality, but they have an image of the Holy Land. Oh, this is, and there's a lot of propaganda narratives that feed onto it. But part of what that does is that it really allows Israel to just grow its violent regime, right? And I actually want to use the word fascism here because I think fascism is what we're seeing in the Israeli regime. It's just growing more and more fascist and more violent. The settler movement, it's really waging extreme forms of violence, whether through, just the attacks and the pogroms that have been increasing, the brutality, it's really, really brutal. It's really, really violent. And there's still there's no process of accountability because it seems like there's something untouchable there. And I think that particularly American Jews have a really important role in dismantling that. And I want to say that, one of the narratives of Zionism that is said about Jewish liberation was that in order for Jews to be free, right, we need to have this separate state. It's a pretty exclusive view. We need to be isolated from the rest of the world, and we can't really trust humanity. So we just need to, colonize Palestine and build a fairy tale land there, basically. But that's not really a model of Jewish liberation that I can fall into, right? Because again, we've been talking about intersectionality and the importance of solidarity. And I really believe that Jewish liberation is actually bound up with Black liberation, with Palestinian liberation, with all people, really. And I think that we need to start challenging this view of the exclusionary, right, chosen people, we deserve this, right, this propaganda narrative, which ends up leading to systemic erasure and oppression of Palestinian people, right? What does it look like to really challenge that narrative and actually articulate a different understanding of Jewish liberation that is not about my liberation is separate from yours, but actually my Jewish liberation is bound up in Palestinian liberation, right? There cannot be freedom if my freedom means oppression of another people. That's not freedom. That's a perpetuation of cycles of violence. That's a trauma loop that we're going into. So I think there needs to be a really strong reshifting of the narrative, and to really understand that. We need to hold Israel accountable. We need an end to this fascism regime, and we need to start by looking at some of the founding of the Israeli state and how that was done, and be unafraid to look at that. And I think that especially with some of the Israeli protests that are going on now, or that are about save Israeli democracy, there's a bit of an unwillingness to look at the fact that in the current Israeli paradigm, when they say democracy, they don't mean democracy. They mean only rights for Jewish people, which is actually an apartheid state. So there's a really intense thing that, I feel like there's a very strong denial narrative there that we really have to work on dismantling, and really examine and really understand, right? Like, what was the founding of the state? How was it built through violence? How can we actually challenge that so that we can actually, right, dismantle these violent cycles that just keep on getting more and more extreme? And I think that's what we've been seeing since 48. There's a bit like just every decade it just becomes more and more extreme. And sometimes for me, every time I go back to Jerusalem, I'm like, can it get even worse? And then it always does. And it's like, how is it possible to keep on getting worse? But we're a bit on this train that has a momentum that's just cycling, and Palestinians are, bearing the burden of that. So I think it's really urgent and it's really imperative that we put an end to this madness.
Thank you, Hadar. A couple of things just I want to strike me. The re-examination since 48, absolutely. Prior to 48, there were different views about Zionism. There were different views. If you ever read Martin Buber, it's very interesting, his resonance with what you're saying. But this was what happened. And also, when you mentioned Nakba, just to say one of the things about the Kabbats of Peace that I'm very connected to and feel very meaningful is they have a Nakba Memorial Day, which they celebrate with both, where the Israelis join the Palestinians to acknowledge Nakba, and we invite as many people as we can all over the world to this moment of hearing the truth. Very powerful. So chiming in for a combatants of peace there. I have a third question really here, really for Eva. Can you share about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's current working definition of anti-Semitism and what it says, and why some people find this definition controversial or unhelpful, and also to share about the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. So these two different declarations on anti-Semitism and why it may be more helpful. I think this relates to everything we've been talking about, including one of the questions that came up on Jewish liberation, which I think Hadar responded to. So yeah, Eva, on those declarations.
Sure. Well, many people may be familiar with the IHRA definition, and some of us may not. But it's a sort of like innocuously titled and worded definition of anti-Semitism and how do we define hatred against Jews. But the entire point of IHRA is to make very clear and codify into law that certain criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And I think actually the Nakba memorial event is a perfect example of why this definition isn't adequate, because one of the things that IHRA states is that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country is not anti-Semitic. Okay, well, did the Nakba specifically happen in a different country? Can we speak about the Nakba under IHRA? And we've seen that in other countries, like in Europe and places where this is much more aggressively codified and universally codified into law, people are being punished for exactly that. Palestinians cannot tell their stories of their families and what happened to them because it violates IHRA. You can't compare under IHRA. It would be anti-Semitic to compare, to say that Israel is guilty of racism or racist as a state. We say that, people say that about the US all the time and they're not arrested for it, right? Like it's starting to get, again, as we talked about how as the reality on the ground in Israel gets further and further and further towards something authoritarian that people can't support, there are increasingly undemocratic and repressive measures designed to protect our unconditional support for it. And IHRA, I think, is certainly one of those that, we don't want people talking about the Nakba. We don't want people talking about racism in Israel. We don't want these conversations to be happening, especially as Palestinian Americans are, more in public and speaking up and narrativizing their experiences. And so we're going to criminalize it. And like, to me, again, that sounds authoritarian. That sounds like, building the kind of country and the kind of system that Jews are also unsafe under. Indeed, like plenty of things that Israelis say, plenty of things that American Jews say. 40% of American Jews under 40 think that Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. IRA has been used to say that it's anti-Semitic, and therefore, where it's codified into law, illegal to call Israel an apartheid state. So 40% of Jews under 40 would be anti-Semites. And like we're seeing, so it's an example of these repressive tactics. The Jerusalem Declaration tries to solve this problem by getting sort of even more specific about where criticism of Israel intersects with the anti-Semitism that is just present in the machine of like white supremacy that we all are like interacting with every day in this country. Just as things like transphobia, racism, like all of those things are like part of the like system that we're operating in the US. And so it's attempting to say like, well, this is what anti-Semitism looks like when it comes to Israel. There have been Palestinians who have criticized the Jerusalem Declaration for centering Israel in the anti-Semitism conversation overall. So I think that what's important about that is just to know that like it could be a really useful tool for parsing out like when conversations about Israel veer into anti-Semitism, but it's actually not helpful big picture in terms of like addressing and fighting anti-Semitism in the US, where the major threat to anti-Semitism is from the right, and it's from like white nationalists who are literally murdering Jews in our synagogues because of things like the Great Replacement theory, where they think that Jews are responsible for letting immigrants into the country and empowering people of color, and undermining the power of like white Christian male Americans. And like there is life-threatening anti-Semitism happening in this country. And so when we keep the conversation focused on like what is it and is not okay to say about Israel without grounding ourselves in the bigger picture, like that actually is dangerous in terms of trying to help people develop the muscle of like fighting and resisting anti-Semitism, just as we want to develop the muscle of fighting and resisting like racism, transphobia, all of these things. When we have it as a distraction and define anti-Semitism as opposing Palestinian liberation, then like that puts us in a trap. And it's actually dangerous for fighting anti-Semitism in this country, which is, and there's been a deeply like clarifying moment when the White House tried to release this like 100+ page plan on anti-Semitism. And as they were releasing it, tons of Jewish establishment organizations, right-wing organizations, were saying like, well, if it doesn't say that IRA is the only definition, it's not worth it. And it's like, okay, so this plan has like tons of things to try to fight anti-Semitism across the US. And you're saying that unless it like is exclusively defines like criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, then it's worthless, then that exposes that the whole point is to try and repress like criticism of Israel, Palestinian stories, and things that just venture a little bit too far. And as Hadar was saying, like a little bit too far to the root of what's going on, which, as we know, like seeing our liberation as tied together is actually the only thing that's going to like keep us safe and get us out of this. And so I would just say that the IRA definition is not only like incorrect, it's actually dangerous, and please resist it wherever you can.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful and very clear, I think. We were going to ask a question about whether the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism is inseparable from fighting other forms of discrimination. In other words, a question about intersectionality of Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation. I think you both really addressed it. You've both been extremely clear about your sense that that is true, and that's what we have to wake up to. It may not be an easy process to come to that awareness, but that's the direction. So I'm going to ask a few questions from the audience, I think, unless there's something else you want to say about intersectionality. That's fine. Hadar?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to say something about the definition of anti-Semitism a bit and just add on to that, because I think there is a very extreme weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence Palestinian voices. You know, and this is not just in the US, this is also in Europe and Germany in particular, where the climate is really, really intense for Palestinians to speak up because they're constantly told that they're being anti-Semitic. And I want to also just expand that understanding a bit because you know, this there's an interest from the right-wing Christian evangelical movement to create friction between Jewish and Muslim communities in particular, because there's this imperialistic war on Islam, right, that justifies the US imperialism in the Middle East with war in Iraq and all sorts of things, right? So there's a bigger actually political picture here. And I feel that a lot of times from the right-wing Christian agenda, there's actually this desire to pit Jews and Muslims against each other and actually use the Jewish community to further an Islamophobic agenda, an anti-Arab agenda that also connects to this anti-Palestinian rhetoric that we're seeing. And I think that in a lot of my work, and one of my desires is for the Jewish community to actually wake up to the way that we're being used actually by these bigger US imperialistic powers. And how can we actually resist that? Right? How can we resist, I see this, you know, the way that my struggle, my oppression, my trauma, my identity is being weaponized against Palestinians, against Muslims, against Arabs in general as well. And how can I say, actually, I do not consent to that, right? And because I think that, you know, right now, especially when Palestinians are being so heavily silenced because of this accusation of anti-Semitism, we really need Jewish voices to defend and to speak up and to say, you know, not in our name, we're not going to allow that to happen, certainly not to silence Palestinians. We're simply telling their real family story. So yeah, I just wanted to add that into the mix.
Great. I want to throw out two questions that came from the community here, the congregation. And you could choose one or respond to either both of them. So the one is, do you see any possibility for limiting the $3.8 billion US aid to Israel as a result of the current Israeli government's position? That's the first one. Do you see that as a possibility? Is it a goal? Is it your hope? And the other one, which is quite different, is, let's see, it has to do with the, let's see here, something about younger people. Do you think there is a shift, at least in the Jewish world, from the younger people? I mean, somebody mentioned that, but how do you see that happening and taking place and being organized? So the age identity with all of these issues. So either one, both kind of practical. Shift among young Israelis and American Jews and seeing the importance of justice for Palestinians and oppression to the present government in Israel. So those two questions, you could, Eva, you want to start, and you can go back and forth, your thoughts. We weren't prepared. These are coming up from the group.
Sure. Well, the $3.8 billion in military aid, if anyone has ideas, also let me know. But one of the things that we want to do, and if not now, is to what we're calling end the blank check. So that's one of the main focuses of what we're interested of our work. And I think there could be a really interesting moment right now where you know, you can, as a social movement, you can map out a strategy, you know, you can try to build power, you can try to do all of these things. And then the Israeli government can do something so, you know, outrageous that it actually could accelerate, you know, something that we thought was going to take many years. And so, and to be clear also in terms of the military aid, what we're asking is for Israel, Israel military aid to Israel to be consistent with other countries, where there are like at minimum, like the minimum ask is to just be consistent with other countries where there are human rights conditions on the military aid that we supply to these other places. And even that sort of like bare minimum ask receives massive opposition. AIPAC has been pouring millions of dollars into Democratic primaries to prevent even a few more members of Congress from like speaking about the possibility. And like, again, that's where I reference like this being so like such a dangerous status quo as US politics get more and more divorced from reality. I think we really could be at like a pivotal moment in the Jewish community around seeing that there actually needs to be this kind of accountability and understanding that the military aid that we give to Israel is not for the benefit of keeping Israelis safe. It's like a gift card for Israel to buy more US weapons and US weapons contractors, and obviously Christian Zionist evangelicals are both extremely fervent supporters of that unconditional military aid. And so I think there could be an opportunity, but we, again, American Jews like really need to then like unite around that and say like, this is a moment for accountability, and unconditional military aid to Israel does not keep us safe. And the people who are saying it does are lying in attempts to harm us in the way that Hadar was saying about sort of like broader US interests. And like we refuse to be used as this political football where our safety and the concept of being like keeping us safe is weaponized in the service of maintaining unconditional support to the Israeli military. And I think that if we can do that, AIPAC will be seen like, and other organizations that are trying to maintain that military aid at all costs and funded mostly at this point by far-right Republican billionaires, those organizations will be seen for what they are, which is as akin to the NRA, akin to weapons contractors, akin to, you know, fossil fuel companies, like things like organizations and lobbies that are trying to protect corporate or military interests at the expense of our shared futures. And that like we actually will be able to change the narrative around like what keeps Jews safe, and that Jewish and Palestinian liberation and safety are tied together.
Great. Thank you. Hadar, thoughts on either one of those?
Yeah, actually, I think they're connected. Well, so first, yeah, I think definitely working to end aid and cut the budget that the US gives to Israel, I think it's actually imperative, because I think on the ground in Israel, Palestine, it's like the situation just keeps getting more and more extreme. And sometimes there's a sense of hopelessness there. And I think international pressure is essential. I think that is one of this is going to be one of the more successful endeavors that we can put our efforts into, and specifically, right, with cutting the military aid. And I think that, you know, just like in the US, where we're having this conversation about policing and how, you know, we actually do need to defund the police because we are giving so much money to policing, and what that's doing is actually increasing crime, right? If we're looking at statistics, the presence of more and more policing actually increases crime. So in the same way, right, there's actually no military solution to Israel-Palestine, even though that's the current narrative, right? It's like, oh, if we just keep on funding this military industrial complex, something different will happen. But actually, no, the more that we feed into this militarization, the more oppressive the situation is going to get. And I think that part of the reason why it's so hard to push this narrative around cutting aid is because right now the frame that is, you know, dominant is that, right, and again, this is kind of connected to the war in Islam and the war in the Middle East, is that the US is fighting terrorism, right? Israel is fighting terrorism, right? This narrative that's very ingrained in the public that Palestinians are terrorists for resisting. And right, that really needs to be dismantled. And I think one of the ways that can be dismantled is actually positioning cutting aid to Israel as an anti-war movement, right? Just like the Vietnam movement or the Iraq movement, and positioning it in a wider understanding of, right, anti-militarization, anti-imperialism, right? Like, what does that actually do when we just endlessly support through weapons, right? A state that has close to zero accountability. So I really believe that the more the narrative sometimes I feel with Israel and the Zionism, so much of it is like really working with mind control and the propaganda narratives and really learning to reshift the narratives. But I think this like really kind of putting a dent into this narrative that has been super strengthened, that like Palestinians are terrorists and Arab Muslims are terrorists, and the US needs to intervene to fight that. I think we really need to have this deeper conversation, right? That just as policing doesn't actually create justice, militarization is not going to create justice. And in terms of the youth and the younger generations, I think that certainly American Jews, we're starting to see a big shift, right? That younger American Jews are challenging Zionist propaganda. They are challenging the ways that they've been taught about Israel, right, being this democracy and all of these things, right? Because they're able to see things a bit more clearly. So I think that is a very exciting change that is happening, and it feels really liberating. And I think also with the building of diasporic, thriving Jewish communities, I think that's related to that. But I think on the ground in Israel, it's a bit of a different situation, which is very scary, right? Is that actually the younger generation is growing more and more extreme. The settler movement is growing really extreme. You have 15, 16-year-old people who are just going into Palestinian villages and feel like they could just burn the village, right? They go into the mosque and they rip out the Quran. Like this extremism is actually growing amongst the younger generation. So I actually see that there's like a kind of like opposing polarity, right? Where the American Jews actually getting more left, but the Israeli youth is getting more right. And it's really tricky because right now, right, especially in Israeli society, people don't really see, right? Even if there are, these really extreme pogroms, and then Israeli society is like, maybe says something that maybe this isn't okay, but they're not able to connect it to the IDF and to the military, right? They still disconnect the settler movement from the army, even though the army and the settlers are actually working together, right? The army protects the settlers in the West Bank. So, I think that there's something there that really needs to be shaken around settlers just having this pass to enact however many forms of violences without any accountability and having this protection from the military. And I think that the cutting of aid will actually go a long way in making that dent.
Well, there's a very eloquent, you're both incredibly eloquent, and I notice a recurrent theme is around what is the narrative? What is the narrative? And how do we distance ourselves from a narrative that we have never questioned in so many different areas as one issue, and also the issue of trauma. And how does that perpetuate itself in various places? There's one last question, and we just have about 2 minutes altogether, 3 minutes, but I think very important for each of you to have a minute to say, how do we keep connected to this ongoing support, information, and action? How do we stay connected to some of the things you've lifted up for us? And is there's a closing word, sentence? So Eva, and I hope maybe Tiffany, Lindsay, you'll have a chance to send out some documents, some information around linking to ongoing action. So, but just a closing moment, Eva.
Sure, I will try to make this really brief. I think that something that I want to share as an example, and then the action item is an example of everything we've been talking about today is Summer Lee's race, where AIPAC was basically trying to say that dump millions of dollars to prevent the first Black woman from being elected to Congress in the state of Pennsylvania, and trying to do some of the stuff that Hadar was talking about, which is divide the Jewish community from other communities, and which obviously is hardest for people like Black Jews who are in both communities. and pit us against each other by saying that like this person is anti-Semitic because she supports Palestinian liberation, and dumping millions of dollars into racist ads for her around that. And including in the general election when they tried to support and elect a Republican who does not support gun control in Pittsburgh. And the Jewish community was like, this is not for us. This is not supporting our liberation. And there's a moment where we have to say, we have to call out like AIPAC for like these types of actions because they are basically the number one entity thwarting progressives across the country right now and dividing our communities and endorsing insurrectionists. And they are one of the major blocks in achieving, again, Jewish liberation, Palestinian liberation, and also like blocking the progressive movement. We're organizing the Jewish community to reject AIPAC, and you can go to rejectaipac.org to learn more. We just launched a national campaign on this, and there's opportunities for everyone to get involved literally right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Hadar.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. Okay, so I think there's two things that are really important. One is really, working with the current situation and understanding, right, whether it's like the home demolitions that happen or the continuous war on Gaza that happens almost every year at this point, right? So, there's kind of like an immediate need for solidarity, for support, whether that is through, right, changing the public narrative, raising our voices, whether it's like sharing funds, right? There's this kind of immediate action. And there's lots of beautiful Palestinian organizations, Jewish organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace does a lot of stuff, if not now, that do this work. And I think that's really important. But I think also it's really important to also have, sometimes it feels like we're just putting out fires, right? Every day we wake up and we're like, oh my God, there's this fire, we have to put it out. And I think that it's time that we also have a more long-term strategy and think more, well, what's the 10-year plan? What's the 30-year plan? And actually allow ourselves to imagine those possibilities, because and this is something that I have learned from a lot of Black Lives Matter activists, that the role of imagination in abolition is super important, right? When we don't allow ourselves to imagine a different future, when we don't allow ourselves to consciously think about what else is possible, we're just going to be caught in the same system that exists. And I think in order to really liberate from the system of oppression, we actually have to bring a new vision of what else is possible. And I think that happens through community and through narrative shifts. And I think that there's, especially in the US, but also in Europe and in all sorts of places, right? There's a huge fear about just talking about Palestine, about asking questions, about, engaging in just like understanding. And I think we need to really break through that fear. And even in these small moments, whether it's like a Shabbat dinner or at a school or workshop or whatever, like really pushing ourselves to be like, well, what does it look like to actually bring this to the table here now, right? What does it look like to not let fear, right, rule? Because the more that we engage in fear, the more that the cycle of oppression just cycles. And what is it like to actually face our fears and then breathe into a new possibility of what we imagine for the secret land?
Perfect ending. Absolutely beautiful. Inspiring, truly inspiring and wise. And thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Tiffany to close.
Wow. Well, Eva, Hadar, Sheila, thank you so much for a truly incredible talk. We got a lot of notes that this is one of the best talks people have attended with us. So I just want to thank you so much. Some quick follow-up. So we will be sending this recording out today or tomorrow. And please share it with others, amplify what you heard today. Our next talk in the series will be on August 15th. It's on feminist solidarity. And we're at time, so I'll just do a quick plug right now. While our online programs are free, we're asking, give what you can to attend. It's Give Get Education program this summer to support our youth education programs in Israel and Palestine. We are trying to raise $40,000 this summer, and we really need your help. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day.